Okay, let me go ahead and get started. I'm Gene Veith. I haven't done my name tags yet. I think for some I named this, I'll do that. Right now at the Provost of Sheridan College, and we're trying to do on the collegiate level what you all are already doing in the grammar school and other school level, bringing classical education back. And in many ways, I think you're farther along than a lot of the colleges, even that are trying to do that, keep discovering more and more about this approach to education. So, and I taught Mequon, Concordia Mequon for many years, and involved in the CCLE from the beginning. But this to talk about kind of what is it? What is this approach to education that we keep talking about, and what it is, why we need it, why it's so important to bring it back. So, I mean, it goes by different. I wanted to describe a lot of things about it and different elements of it, but I also want to get into the kind of the philosophy behind it, the pedagogy behind it. And so we'll get into a lot of things today. So, we talk about classical education. That's how it's going. The term that's used in the name of our organization. Here, let's get started. Classical education, that's one word for it. What does that mean? Well, classical in the sense of, classic means something that stood the test of time. A classic book is one that we read over and over in every generation. It means the particular classical languages, Greek, Hebrew, and again, a lot of schools have Latin, these ancient languages, and say these ancient works, classics, the classical philosophy, like Dr. Kopp was talking about Plato and Aristotle, and although we probably do more with that on the college level than you get into first grade classes. But it all does tie together, so I'll kind of explain to you. And I think maybe a better term for it that really gets at the philosophy behind it and the teaching approaches is the liberal arts. And one of the things you'll find is that if you've been teaching in regular kinds of schools, it's not completely different, because the liberal arts approach is so foundational to all of education that there's still a lot of remnants of it, even in a typical modern progressive classroom. Typically, you're teaching a whole lot of subjects, right? You teach history and arithmetic and social studies and literature and science and all these things, rather than specializing just in one, or just in a very narrow range, which is more what happens at the college level. So that's an element of a liberal arts approach that still goes on, even in the public schools today. What's happened is forgetting a lot of the philosophy behind it, or the educational philosophy that lies behind it, and kind of what it all means to teach that way, and ways to teach it. It's sort of, some of that's fallen by the wayside. So I want us to think about liberal arts education, a Lutheran liberal arts education. We'll talk about all parts of that. It's interesting that Lutheran reformers talk a lot about the liberal arts. And for you, Luther said in the handout, parents cannot prepare a more dependable treasure for your children than education in the liberal arts. Yeah, it's a dependable treasure. It's a treasure, something really valuable, and it's also something you can depend on throughout your life. We'll get into those aspects of it. But Luther says that's the best thing parents can give to their children. Not wealth, not a big inheritance, not just education, and education in the liberal arts. Okay, we'll get into that. It's even in the large catechism, sort of. In the Latin translation of the large catechism, this is the English translation of that, the part. Well, let's just read it. This is the explanation of the fourth commandment about honor your father and mother. And Luther gets into what parents need to be, or fathers and mothers need to be doing for their children. For if we wish to have excellent and apt persons, both for civil and ecclesiastical government, we must spare no diligence, time, or cost in teaching and educating our children, that they may serve God and the world. Serving God and the world. I'm going to give another talk later about vocation, and I'm going to be using it in a little more detail about it. But the idea that providing an education for children is one of the duties of parenting. This is one of the reasons why the Lutheran tradition puts so much emphasis on educating children. It's a confessional document. We've got to. It's in our confession. But let's read on. We must not think only how we may amass money and possessions for them. For God can indeed without us support and make them rich, as He daily does. The idea that just even giving an education that enables children to make money, that's not the only kind of education they need. Yes, they may need to know. Again, I'll get into that about vocation when I hear that talk. But that even education is not just about learning, practical job skills. Okay, that's what a lot of people today think education is for. But there's another dimension to it. That there's some things worth learning in themselves. Some things that are worth learning because they develop you as a human being. Okay, this is the liberal arts dimension of education. But go on. Because for this purpose He has given us children and issued this command that we should train and govern them according to His will, else He would have no need of father and mother. Now here's the kicker, this part of the bow. Let everyone know therefore that it is his duty, on peril of losing the divine favor, to bring up his children above all things in the fear and knowledge of God. And if they are talented, have them learn and study something, so they may be employed for whatever need there is. And now this part in brackets. To have them instructed and trained in a liberal education, that men may be able to have their aid in government and in whatever is necessary. Okay, in a liberal education. Yeah, that's what we're going to talk about. That's what classical education is. It would seem that having a classical education is confessionally required, right, for Lutherans. Except for the fact that this is the Latin version, and the German version doesn't have that part about the liberal education. It just says give them an education. And in our theology, for some reason, you pastors can explain, the German version is the one that everybody has to agree to uphold. So, but if we went by the Latin version, all of our Lutheran schools would be classical. But anyway, we'll get into why they said this. Why Luther and the other reformers emphasize this kind of education in particular. But let's talk about what it is. The best best way to start probably is by thinking of why is it called what it's called? A liberal education. Liberal arts. You know, we're conservatives, right? We're conservative arts. Conservative. Well, again, this is the way to do that. But the reason it's called that is because the Latin word that we have, liberal, it comes from a Latin word meaning freedom. Libera, education liberalis, an education for freedom. And it goes back to the time of the Greeks and the Romans, who pioneered a lot of this, that they had actually two kinds of education. They had an education for slaves, education servilis, and they had an education for people who were free, education liberalis. So if you were a slave, again, Greeks and the Romans, amazing civilization, but they also had a lot of very brutal things, and one of them was their reliance on slavery. But even the slaves needed to know things. They needed to have a certain kind of education so they could, do their jobs correctly, follow orders, keep records, read written instructions, things like that. An education that contributed to the economy. The old education servilis was for basically what we would call job training, frankly. Training to do a job. If you were a slave, you need an education. If you're going to be a potter or being a manufacturer or something, you needed an education of a certain kind to do that. But if you were a citizen of the Greek democracy, or a citizen of the Roman Republic, in other words, if you were a free citizen, you needed another kind of education. Okay? Because in those experiments in self-government, the citizens had to make the big decisions for the country, right? In Athens, should we go to war or not? Well, everybody gathered together in the marketplace and talked about it, and debated it, and tried to figure out what to do. And if that democracy was going to work, every citizen needed to be able to think well to make the decisions that needed to be done, right? Even in the Roman Republic, which was a representative kind of government. This is before the empire took over. The Greeks had a republic that lasted for, I think 500 years. And our Senate and our balance of powers and our rule of law and our court system, to this day, really goes back to the Romans and to Roman law. But if you were a citizen, you needed to be able to use your mind in certain ways. Okay? Because in this kind of system, every individual was not only the subject, but a ruler. Okay? And that's the same way it is in our democratic republic. Yes, we have rulers that we're to submit to and so on, but our very rulers are subject to us. And so we have the vocation of being a ruler. For those of us who are lucky enough to be born in this system. Anyway, so the education for freedom, an education that would equip people to be free. Politically, that was part of it. Socially, that was part of it. But also to be free of the things that could get the masses so stirred up so easily, which is the downfall of the Greek democracy, frankly. The demagogue would get up and start, speaking so eloquently and getting people all excited and appealing to their passions rather than their minds. And they found that that was all too easy to do. And look at today's politics, I see that's still the same way. And again, I worry about, can we sustain our system of freedom without an education for freedom? It seems to me that the education that most people have and want is an education for slavery. It isn't just education liberalis that's coming back. It's the education servilis, the servile education for slavery. And I want that's all they want. I've had students, I'm where I am now, well, in Mequon, frankly, when I was there. So why do I have to take all these liberal arts requirements? You know, I want to just teach me enough so I can get a good job, make lots of money. That's all I care about. And they talk like that, and then I would hear them and say, do you want to be a slave? No, I don't want to be a slave. But you're thinking like a slave. You're wanting the education of a slave. Don't you want to be free? And anyway, they learned to avoid me when I was talking about that. But that's an important question. That's really the issue. An education for freedom versus an education for slavery. And it's very interesting that when the Lutheran, we'll get this a little bit later, when Luther started the school, the Reformation, the necessity for everyone to be able to read the Bible at a time when most people couldn't read anything. Again, opening schools to teach everybody. The whole concept of universal education comes from Martin Luther. Okay. And they would say, yes, but you don't want the peasants to learn how to read. Say, oh yeah, the peasants need to read. And then they would say, but you don't need women to learn to read, have a good education. And Luther was maybe the first to argue for the full education of women, as well as men, girls as well as boys. Now, the education they started was not just a Bible reading school, but the school they started also gave a liberal education, an education for freedom. And those peasants who learned how to read and who got this kind of education, they didn't stay peasants for very long. And you started to have the unprecedented social mobility and the rise of the middle class that accompanied the Reformation. And eventually political freedoms would follow. And that took a while. But this is a very powerful kind of education. And the purpose is to form people to be free. Now, and even when America was founded, you read the founders, Madison, Adams, they talk about education, necessity. If this experiment in constitutional government is going to work, we have to have an educated citizenry. And the kind of education they were talking about was a liberal education. But what is that? What kind of education forms someone to be free? And as it developed from the Greeks, but really is systematized by the Christians and developing over some time, this idea of the liberal arts came into being. Liberal arts. And the arts is not what we think of art as, being able to make a pretty picture or make beautiful music or whatever. Art referred to the things the human mind can do. They used to say that everybody makes their living by a combination of art and nature. Okay, a farmer makes a living by nature, the crops grow. But it isn't just nature, you have to bring art to it. You have to know the art of farming. And you have to know what to do, how to, plant certain things, and how to cultivate the soil, and how to do all the things that farmers do. And everything is that way. The cobbler, somebody that makes shoes, is working with nature, leather and the physiology of the human foot, but also has to bring something to it from the human mind, right? To craft the leather and to make it into shoes. And so some things are pretty much all art. They speak of the art of teaching. The teachers, yes, there's a body of knowledge that you're trying to convey, or you're trying to make your students grow in some ways. But see, what you bring to it is an art. Your mental power applied to the subjects that you're teaching to communicate it and convey it to your students. So medicine is considered an art. And you still hear them talk about it this way. And this goes back to the whole tradition here. The art of medicine. Yes, it's a science, but it's also an art. Anyway, so an art is anything that the human being can do, or that the human mind can accomplish. Fine arts, again, that's a type of art. Just making something for its own sake, making something to be beautiful. So right, a painter is applying art. But art is really a lot broader than that. So the liberal arts that were taught in this liberal education, this education for freedom, there were 7 of them. And these were divided into 2 types. The trivium basically were the arts of language. The quadriviums were basically the arts of mathematics. And even today, I read an educator, not from the classical tradition, saying that basically what we're teaching is either language or mathematics. Those are the 2 types of knowledge, and everything else kind of comes from that. But the idea a person to be free, an education equipping a person for freedom, should have strong skills in language and strong skills in mathematics. So the trivium, these are the 3 arts that relate to language. These are the ones that get most of the attention today in classical education circles for lots of good reasons. Especially those of you who are teaching on a grammar school level. But the 3 liberal arts that make up the trivium, and the trivium just means 3 ways. Tri means 3, and vium means ways, or roads. So the 3 roads are grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So the master language, you need to know basic grammar. You need to know, just apply it to learning a language. You need to know, the vocabulary and the rules and how you express different things. But that's not all. So to really be able to master a language, you certainly need it. You also need to be able to think in that language. Right, to use the language to sort out ideas and think correctly in a language. That would be the logic level. And also, you need to be able to express yourself in the language, right? Where you take your own ideas, what you want to say, and you know how to say it in the language, right? But this applies to to learning, Latin or Spanish or whatever. It also applies to mastering English, to learning how to read and write. Again, you master the grammar, the letters and the sounds the letters make, and the basic things of how the alphabet works and how to draw the letters in writing. But again, that's not all. You can do that and still not be very good at language. Then, to master logic, or in other words, a logic level is dialectic, which means conversation, dialogue, questions and answers. Okay, when you're doing that, so you're using the language on a higher level. And then rhetoric is the ability to speak or write effectively, eloquently, to persuade others. So, you know the language, you know the grammar, the basic elements of it, you know the logic, the dialectic, how to handle ideas in the language, and you know how to use that language effectively so that it persuades others. Again, this is important for education for freedom because, again, in democracy, the person who could use language best could usually talk other people into, the policy that he's advocating. But it's really a model for knowing something very thorough, in a very thorough way. One way that classical schools tend to use this is developmentally. Dorothy Sayers writes about this, that using grammar works really well on the most basic levels, at the grammar school level, where little kids are really good at memorizing and learning things and mastering the basic elements. And then about kind of get into middle school age when they start talking back and asking why and giving all kinds of trouble. That's because they're developmentally at the age where their minds are ready for logic, dialectic. And so then you teach them to do that effectively, but to be able to answer the questions why things are the way they are. And they're at another level. Then in the high school level where if people want to reach out to their peers, want to make connections with others, and they're really worried about their friends. They worry nobody understands me, but they want to be understood. And that's when they're ready for the rhetoric level, where you teach them to express themselves so that people understand them and they make connections with others. And so other classical schools use that as kind of a developmental model, going from teaching the rhetoric level through logic, through rhetoric. But one of the points that I try to emphasize is that the trivium also works just as a paradigm for learning anything thoroughly. It's not just a developmental level. And I think some schools, they apply it very kind of mechanically. And they don't look at the content of the trivium as much as they might. One point that I've made in some of the things I've read about classical education is that the trivium, first of all, can be used to learn any subject. Any subject. Because every field of knowledge has its grammar, its basic language, its basic terminology, its basic facts to master. But it also involves a certain way of thinking. So it has its logic, and it also has its rhetoric, where a person on his or her own has to use and apply what they've learned. So if you're teaching, anything, driver's ed. To teach someone how to drive a car, there's certain things you just need to know about, because there's a grammar of driver's ed, right? What the signs mean, what the controls of your car mean, how to do this, how to do that, what the rules of the road are, what the traffic laws are. You just have to learn those. That's the grammar of it. But then you also, in order to become a driver, have to start thinking in a certain way, right? There's a certain kind of awareness that you have to develop as a driver when you're on the road, and that's really important. But that's the logic of driver's ed, and the rhetoric of driver's ed. What would that be?
Justifying the ticket.
You're trying to talk your way out of the ticket. You're trying to talk your parents and let you use their car. Well, just using the car. Actually, even when driver's ed is taught, you do this stuff in the classroom where you're learning grammar, and you're watching, scary movies of auto wrecks to teach you to be careful and to think while you're driving. And then finally, you have to actually get behind the wheel, right? And the teacher has the brake on the other side. My nephew is just going to go through this. So just getting behind the wheel and actually driving, that's kind of the rhetoric, isn't it? Where you're actually yourself, you're getting where you want to go using this vehicle and the knowledge that you've acquired. But it's the same way for anything. For history, there's certain names and dates and events and historical happenings. This morning we went down to the Little Bighorn monument to see what Custer's last name was. That's fascinating. There's so many interesting things in history. So just knowing the events of history, that would be the grammar of it. But there's also a logic of history, where you're trying to understand what happened, and why did Custer do this? What were the issues? What were the policies against trying to resettle the Indians there? Of course, that's going to provoke these kind of responses. And so there's a logic of history. So history is not just a matter of learning the names and dates. Some people stop at that. But also learning the ideas and thinking things through. That's where you really get into history. That's the logic of it. And finally, the rhetoric of it. I suppose that would be, applying the lessons of history on your own. So when somebody's reading a newspaper, they can bring to bear in original ways the lessons of history and apply them to things that we encounter every day. Anyway, whether you're teaching math or science, math obviously is a grammar of math, multiplication table, all of those things. But the logic of history, or math, I think of algebra, right, where you have story problems, where you're having to think and apply the things you've learned in arithmetic in these other ways. And then the rhetoric is probably using math to solve your own problems. Okay, my carpet in our house, how much will we need, how much will it cost? All of that. So, as classical educators, I encourage you to try to use the trivium as kind of a paradigm for ensuring thorough instruction, in-depth instruction on whatever you're teaching. And that you can do that on every level. I mean, it may be that in a second grade class, they're mostly on the grammar level. You're not going to get into a lot of deep ideas, maybe. And they're not going to be able to do a lot of, their own original experimentation. But very young children do ask why. And they do want to do things with it. And so I think classical educators at every level, in different ways tailored to the class, the particular children that you're working with, you can use this as a very powerful method. I mean, even on the college level, I find myself, when I'm planning my units, I teach literature. I always want my students to know the material, to know some things, learn something maybe they haven't known before, know the grammar of it, but I also want them to understand it. And that gets into the logic level. And I want them to do something with it on their own. And that's kind of the rhetoric level. And so in simple lesson plans, you can make use of this to generate a lot of ideas. Again, on handout, structure for learning. Think of grammar in terms of knowledge. Logic, think in terms of developing understanding. Rhetoric, think of it as early individual creative application. There's been a lot of educational reforms today where people are desperately looking for something that works. And that's what they'll do. They'll take one part of these, one part of the liberal arts and run with it. You have a back to basics movement where young people these days don't know the basics, or we're going to teach the basics. That's good. That's good. They do need to know that. But that's not all. And the back to basics classrooms, they're really making them learn a lot of facts, but I don't know that they're necessarily making them that are educated. Just the critical thinking movement that a lot of schools are doing. Teaching to think. Okay, so that they're focusing on the logic part of it, right? Again, which is good, very classical. But some of them are teaching to think without teaching them anything to think about, right? It's just a process without content, and they often don't get anywhere. Some that I've seen basically comes to sort of questioning everything. Pledge allegiance to the flag. Well, why do you do that? That's critical thinking. Well, because I'm a country. Well, why do you do that? Well, because the people will follow. Well, why do you do that? And just one question after another, and it never ends anywhere. And then the other approach, it's used a lot today in kind of constructivist education, is to have the children do creative activities. And that's kind of the rhetoric level. And I've heard they'll have science classes. They'll study global warming. I have all the kids sit around sharing what they feel about global warming and giving their opinions about it. Well, but the key, though, is to do all of these, do all three of them. And when you do, you really got something. I mean, if the students know something about global warming and about the science of atmosphere or whatever, they have the grammar of it, and they understand it, they know about the science of it, then they give a very good discussion about their opinions about global warming, right? But again, what makes that work is to make sure you're doing all three of those liberal arts, right? And not just one in isolation. There are teaching methods associated with the different parts of the trivium. You should know this. On the grammar level, the teacher functions, it's been said, as a coach. And in sports, one of the things coaches do is you keep practice, right? And so learning the alphabet, or learning phonics, or learning multiplication tables, a lot of that takes practice. and the teacher is making sure that the student practices until they get it. Okay, and that's a way. I mean, there's other kinds of kind of direct instruction that can happen on the grammar level. This is the letter A. This is the sound the letter A makes. This is the spelling of a cat. Explain that. But then they have to internalize it. They have to practice it. So the coach on grammar, or the teacher is acting as a coach. When you're teaching logic, this goes way back to Plato, actually, we were talking about. But some of the early educators, he used the image of the midwife. And in teaching understanding, the key, what the teacher wants to do is have the child. Well, you're helping the person. You're helping your student give birth to the idea. Okay, you're stretching the midwife image all day. You might want an obstetrician, but the key is to do things so that the child kind of discovers it for himself or herself, because that's when they're really thinking. And it's not just telling them the answer. I mean, yeah, you have to do that sometimes, especially on the grammar level. But when you're teaching logic, to help us to guide the students through a thought process where the light comes on in their mind and they come up with the idea. This again is the other word for logic is dialectic, and the way Plato and Socrates they just mastered this, the art of questions and answers. Not where the student is asking questions, but where the teacher is asking students questions in such a way that they're leading them through this process of discovery. A great example, Socrates said, he believed that knowledge was innate, which I think isn't completely correct, but he took a slave boy, actually, and he led him through a series of questions so that he was defining these complicated mathematical theorems. It was as good as anything, but it was by carefully asking questions, leading questions, not just open-ended questions, but leading questions to lead them to the truth. Okay? That's a very powerful style. It's called the dialectical teaching, or Socratic questioning. There are books and workshops and videos on this, about how to do it. And it's a true art. But the point is, understanding tends to be taught through dialectic, through conversation, through back and forth conversation, through discussion, in other words. So, in a typical classroom, yeah, there will be times where you're just giving students information and making them practice it until they learn it. That's grammar. But when you're trying to get them to understand something, you hold a discussion, right? And it's not just an open-ended discussion where every answer is equally valid, but it's one where you're trying to lead the students to discovery. Okay, I'll give them examples of that soon. And then teaching on the rhetoric level, the teacher plays the role of the audience. The teacher, it's the student who has to perform. The student has to get up and give a speech, and then you as a teacher give them feedback. Or the student writes a paper, and then you give feedback to the student. Say, I didn't understand this point. Or this didn't sound right. What did you mean by that? Maybe make them keep working on it until it is effective, right? But the teacher, functions just as the audience. Notice one of the beauties of classical education is that it takes a lot of pressure off the teacher. Now, I realize this because you're like, I've never had this kind of education. How am I going to teach all this hard stuff to my kids? Well, the way classical education works, the burden is on the student. And you as the teacher, you're making practice, you're being the coach, you are talking with the student, carrying on a conversation, and you're serving as the audience for the student's work. Okay? This is why this works so well with homeschooling, because it actually asks less of the parents who maybe don't know all this. Now, again, some people try to teach classical education as if it's all grammar and just try to present a bunch of stuff to them. But that's really missing the point of classical pedagogy. The whole beauty of it is it's turning the student into a free person who can function on his or her own, to whatever level they can. So, I would encourage you to kind of play some of those roles as you're working with your students. But that's the trivium. A very powerful way to apply, the liberal arts, those three language liberal arts, and but it helps you to teach anything in depth.
How does grading per se work into that? Because it seems like the parents could care less about the process; they want to see the end result.
Well, I don't know. Grading's always a challenge, and I think it works differently on each of the levels. There are some things you'll grade that are just on the grammar level. You're either right or wrong. No question about that. And they practice, they learn, they do the multiplication table, and you count the number of mistakes they have. On the midwife level, on the understanding level, again, it's conversation. These are difficult to grade discussions, isn't it? On the rhetoric level, your grading is part of the feedback. Okay, I cannot understand what you were saying here. Or there's so many grammatical mistakes, it was distracting. Or this is very excellent. It's really persuaded me. And that's something you can grade. And so grades become just another way of giving feedback. We are up against some misunderstood ways about education when you take a liberal arts approach. Some people are just pragmatists, and all they want is the end result. They don't care if somebody learned or not. Well, again, you may have to teach them about that you're trying to do more with your students than just what they expect. Okay, let me just go through these other elements, and we'll leave some more time for question and discussion. The quadrivium, these four liberal arts are arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And the emphasis in the way it was always taught is the mastery of numbers. And this is very odd. Somebody asked me to address where classical education is today, and my answer was we've gotten pretty good with the trivium. What needs to happen now is mastery of the quadrivium, the other four liberal arts. Okay. Because for one thing, this opens up the whole realm of science and teaches mathematics. In a way, right now everybody's saying, students don't know math these days, and every progressive attempt to teach math is failing miserably. And frankly, even the methods of teaching math in our classical schools, Saxon math and others, it's not really classical. It's teaching math as a separate subject that isn't connected to anything else. That's really very progressive. At least it teaches the basics maybe better than the math where you're making up your own math rules. But somebody needs to implement a classical approach to teaching mathematics. And I can't do it, but if any of you have that ability, that's just what's needed now. But let me just give you a vision of it for how it functioned in the 7 liberal arts. Veith, the great Christian thinker towards the end of the Roman Empire, he was a great systematizer of the quadrivium. And he explained it this way. He said, arithmetic is numbers, geometry is numbers in space, music is numbers in time, and astronomy is numbers in space and time. Okay. Now, what do you mean by that? Well, obviously arithmetic numbers, and those numbers are absolute truths. If you want somebody to learn how to think objectively and how to understand that there actually is truth that you don't make up for yourself, it's mathematics. I think the loss of mathematics has contributed to the relativism that we have in our postmodern times. Not just that, arithmetic, an interesting article about this. In a way, numbers are mental constructions. Okay, there are all these things you can do with them. The amazing thing, though, is they work in the objective universe. That all these theorems that you think of, these mental ideas in numbers, you can apply them in the physical world because nature follows these mental realities, these mental absolutes. And, to me, we talk about creation and intelligent design, and the very fact of mathematics, to me, is evidence that there's a mind behind the natural order. But anyway, we've completely lost this classical and Christian understanding of mathematics. I think we would do well to bring it back. Geometry, in space. And geometry included not just, making triangles and proofs, although really good practice in logic if you study geometry, but the way it was done in the old days, things like drawing was part of geometry, and things like architecture, engineering, designing a bridge that will, carry the weight of, so many chariots or whatever, or semi-trucks. Those are great exercises, and what it does is to teach a person to navigate spatial knowledge, right? A lot of what we call the fine arts, becoming artistically literate, would have been kind of taught in geometry, kind of in that mode. And then music. Okay, now music brings out the whole aesthetic dimension of life, the perception of beauty. And in the old liberal arts schools under music, they didn't just teach how to play a musical instrument, things like poetry, things like literature. It would be taught under the aspect of music. And so that cultivates the arts of being sensitive to beauty. And that turns out to be very mathematical, because music is numbers in time, rhythm and harmony. And our physics professor, I sat in on his physics class, and he was teaching about wave theory. And he was showing the physics of waves. He had a giant slinky that he was doing things with. If you hold the slinky at a certain point, if you just shake it, it'll be all chaotic. If you hold it at a certain point, there will be orderly waves. And he said, this is how music works. You take a guitar string and push it down at a certain geometric point, you're going to have different notes, and they're going to be harmonious. Whereas if you don't, it's going to sound discordant, and it's going to be noise. The difference between noise and music is a matter of both physics and mathematics. Anyway, it was fascinating. He did a good liberal arts job of relating science and math and music and art and everything together. And that's very characteristic of the liberal arts approach to anything, make those connections. But anyway, music, mathematics becomes an entryway to music, and music becomes an entryway to mathematics. And if you study music theory, you see how so much of it is mathematical. But I think understanding music and being able to tell good music from bad music is a survival skill today. Right? Because I think a lot of young people form their moral beliefs and their religious beliefs about the kind of music they listen to. And I think this is a very important art that we need to cultivate. So astronomy, that isn't like, our modern astronomy discovering, black holes and speculating about things like that. Things like being able to predict eclipses. Complicated mathematical. So again, numbers in space and time, and to calculate the motions of the seasons and all of that. But again, it opens up the dimension of empirical knowledge. So I think very few of our schools do much with astronomy, but we might teach chemistry or physics. But the value, which is fine, and the value of that is empirical learning. Close observation, and then seeing how close observation of things corresponds to mathematical patterns, which is the basic for the whole scientific method. Anyway, those are the 7 liberal arts. Also, though, there were 3 liberal sciences. Okay, this is something that also I think we need to bring back. Science means, just what comes from the Latin word scientia, for knowledge. And the sciences are the content of what you're learning, what you're teaching. So the arts are things the mind can do, the sciences are the things that the mind can know. And there were 3 sciences that they used just to classify all the different kinds of knowledge. The natural sciences, that's knowledge of nature, obviously. And that includes what we think of science, biology and physics and things like that. But also, liberal arts, philosophy, and metaphysics, knowledge of the natural world, not just in the sense of trees and flowers, but the knowledge of the creation, the knowledge of objective truth, objective reality, natural science. And then the moral sciences, knowledge of the human being, the humanities, what we would call political science, law, ethics. History was considered a moral science, which also tells you some of the things that they did in studying history, to draw out the moral lessons from history. And then the theological sciences, that's the person knowledge of God. Knowledge of theology, knowledge of Scripture. Now, in the universities of those times, they would divide their faculties into natural science faculty, the moral science faculty, the theological science. Remember the saying, theology used to be called the queen of the sciences? Okay, that goes back to the old liberal arts education. And it's the queen of the sciences because knowledge of God ultimately holds all the others together. God is the source of the natural world. He's the source of the human world. He's the source of what's right and wrong. He's the source of spiritual reality. He's the source of grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. And again, as Christian educators, that God holds all of it. It all traces back to Him ultimately. It's not necessary to, I've heard people say, well, how can I Christianize math? Well, you don't have to Christianize. It's already Christian. It already testifies to the Creator of the whole universe. And again, to cultivate that kind of sensibility, you don't have to necessarily, wrench everything out of its context or turn it into theology. But theology is the framework for everything else. Okay. Those are the 7 liberal arts, the 3 liberal sciences. There are other traits. These are primary sources. There's not just, still I think a lot of us probably rely on secondary textbooks too much. If they're really classical, we'll try to use the actual works instead of reading just about history. And I think there's still a place for those. But to try to read, some of the writings of the people that you're studying, or the journals of people who lived at that time, to try to get inside the minds of people who lived through that period. Good example of primary sources would be Luther, controversy with the scholastics. To actually read the Bible, not just commentaries on the Bible or theological treatises about the Bible, but actually read the Bible. And that impulse to go back to the source is very characteristic of express education. Emulation was excellent. The progressive educators would say things like, it doesn't matter what a child reads as long as he knows how to read. Classical educators said, well, but let's not read something that's really good. And so to try to make use of what's really excellent is another hallmark of this approach to education. And also, it's comprehensive and unified. Is you're studying all these different things because you want your students to cultivate every part of their God-given powers. Understanding that some, will have more powers in one area than in others. But whatever that is, and even if it's to do what you can, cultivate what God has given them. It's comprehensive, but then it's unified. It's tied together. Okay, this is a big difference with modern progressive education, where you study everything in isolation. And when you're in college, you study, one narrow little thing, but you don't really know much about anything else. But a liberal arts approach, even to college education, tries to tie things together, to tie the different disciplines together so that they can mutually illuminate each other. And again, other features, classical languages, great books. Now, what's the connection of Lutheranism to this, though? There is a new book that's come out, and you go to the education, you go to a bookstore here, and there's flyers from CPH. Thomas Korchak, Lutheran pastor, his doctoral dissertation on this. And his book, I was hoping it would come out by the time of this conference. It's supposed to be available in August. It's almost out. But anyway, you can sign up for it. I think there's a flyer on it. It is just revolutionary in the way, in what it shows about Lutheran education. What he shows is that from the beginning, Lutheran education can be defined as liberal arts plus catechesis. Liberal arts plus catechesis. Notice, by the way, that catechesis follows liberal arts education methodology. In the catechism, notice you have, the children, learn the catechism. That's kind of the grammar of it. A lot of churches stop right there, whereas the catechism is in the form of questions and answers, which is the dialectic. That's the dialectical method, and it answers the question of what does this mean, right? And so in catechesis, yes, children should learn Bible verses and the creed and even the words of the catechism, but in catechesis, you're trying to get them to understand what you're saying, right? The parents and pastors interact. That's the logic of it. And then the rhetoric is when the child has to make it his or her own. Stand up before the whole church and confess his faith. And continue to live out that faith. That's the rhetoric. So catechesis itself is a great example of liberal arts approach to education. Yeah.
And I guess something that's particularly consonant with the Lutheran tradition is our understanding that it's not about this one-time sort of decision for Christ, click. It's participation in the life of the church, and catechesis is in that sense ongoing.
It is ongoing.
I mean, it's as a teacher. I mean, I'm a young teacher. I've only taught for a year, and I'm sure parents know this better than any, especially parents are teachers.
Yeah.
But you, in teaching, in the dialectic, you're learning. You're revisiting truths that are, fairly rote and familiar, but in revisiting them, there's something fresh about them, and it's the constant, again, participation in them that you sort of steep in, I guess.
Yeah, it's very well said. And so that's a uniquely, not uniquely, but it's a characteristic Lutheran thing we do, or emphasis on catechesis. Korczak says that the people, not just from Luther through Walther and others, thought that a liberal education is the best way to teach people how to think like Lutheran, so they'll be open to the knowledge of the catechism. In other words, instead of thinking about that religion just about what goes on inside me, to learn about there are objective truths and all the rest of it. Here's what I most appreciate about Korczak's book. He also shows how the battles, the theological battles, were accompanied by educational battles. Of course, Luther standing up to the scholastics did have classical education in the university, but they emphasized logic. And so they had always logical breakdowns, whereas the Renaissance educators emphasized rhetoric, which included reading the original sources and, like the Bible. But beyond that, the humanists, like Erasmus, Erasmus thought that liberal education was enough to form a moral, upright Christian person. And Luther said, well, no, it's not enough. You need the gospel, the Word of God. You need catechesis. Okay? And so again, yes, liberal education, but also catechesis. If you're going to be a Lutheran educator. But then, this is what I did not know, the enthusiasts, the ones who thought, you were just inspired directly, that they opposed the liberal arts as being too worldly. If you're reading pagan authors, you're reading non-Christian, you shouldn't read those. Don't teach us anything except how to read the Bible. Okay, so that was the battle the Lutherans faced. It's not just worldly. These are important because God put us in the world, and these are gifts from God too. The pietists who came along a little bit later, who thought that it's all just a matter of your pious actions. They wanted an education of just vocational training. They thought the liberal arts was worldly, They weren't that big on catechesis either, because that's just, rote learning theology. It has to be from the heart. The schools really, all they should do is teach people how to make a living. Okay? And so again, that was another educational battle that the Lutherans who opposed them said, no, you need liberal arts and catechesis both. And then, of course, the rationalists taught that the liberal arts is too old-fashioned, that science is the only way to learn. We don't need to read these old books or these old authors. We'll just have scientific education. So there's another way about that. What Korczak also shows is that the Saxon immigrants who came over from Germany, a big reason they came was because of what was going on in the schools. But actually, the congregations were allowed to kind of continue their, Orthodox Lutheranism, but the schools the kids were going to were not. Yes. So anyway, it's just a very illuminating book and very easy to read, and I think it'd be paradigm shifting in our synodical circles. Another, I'll just go quickly, and then we'll have some time for questions. Progressive education. Oh, the other reason that the Lutherans stressed liberal education, I think, was the doctrine of vocation, not in the sense of job training, but in the sense that God made each person individually and called them to ways of loving and serving their neighbors, not just in the workplace, but especially in the family, and as citizens, and as their participation in the church. So that was another theme of the classical Lutheran schools. And also, I think, Luther's idea of freedom in the gospel. Yes, we're slaves to sin. Yes, he wrote the bondage of the will, but Luther's greatest work has to be the freedom of the Christian. And that the gospel sets us free. Sets us free to serve God, sets us free to love and serve our neighbors in multiple ways. And so this education for freedom and this Lutheran manifestation is really very, very natural, fitting. Okay, time for some few questions and comments.
How do you spell his last name? Thomas?
Korczak. K-O-R-C-O-K.
He was the one on 9/11.
What?
Was he the author on that one about 9/11?
I don't think so. I don't know. I'm not familiar with that. This is Thomas Korczak. He's a Canadian pastor. But Lutheran Education from Wittenberg to the Future. That's the name of it. So I think you'll get a flyer from it. It'll really give you a lot of ideas too, because he goes into the curriculum, what they actually taught in these schools and how it actually played out. It's fascinating. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
I'm a little confused.
Okay.
When you were talking about math has its own grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and then arithmetic becomes part of the quadrivium.
Yeah, it is. Okay. The way I'm looking at the liberal arts, they're not just as subjects. Subjects come out of the sciences. What do you want to teach? What do you need to teach in your class? And maybe the state has a requirement that you need to teach, health or the history of your state or something like that. You'll find that classical schools tend to teach the same subjects as public schools. I think a key thing is how you do it, and also what it means, what all these subjects mean. And the liberal arts approach can help with that. So, they kind of overlap, but you can have a course in logic, a lot of classical schools do, where you're learning about formal logic. But even that is taught kind of on the grammar level. You learn the different kinds of syllogisms and things like that, the different fallacies. And then, but you have to understand them, and then you have to actually put them in practice by having debates or something. And so I'm looking at the arts in terms of what the mind can do, not just as subjects. So whatever subjects you have, which I think would be more for the sciences, I mean, that's how you think of them, you can apply these. Now, it's true, there's a course, these can be courses also, geometry, and so Euclidean geometry, and astronomy. But even if you don't teach astronomy, I think it's possible to teach what the classical educators did with it by teaching maybe biology or physics, one of the sciences that most of us teach, and have facilities to teach at your school. But even when you're studying, history, you can look at the state of the empirical sciences at that time. So it's not just the history of war and politics, but you can bring these kind of astronomy dimension to it. You can bring music to it by studying the music of that period. And so...
So in some ways, the quadrivium is ways of thinking, but I may have just oversimplified it.
Yeah, it is ways of thinking, but I think we do so little with mathematics and such today, and we teach it in such an isolated way that somehow we need to do the quadrivium what we've done with the trivium. And again, I'm not qualified to figure out how to do that. So we tend to teach them as subjects. And that's fine, that's something, that's better than nothing. But even when you teach astronomy, or when you teach music, you're going to still find yourself applying the trivium to it. Teaching music, yes, there's certain basic things you learn about the notes and the scales, and then you learn to understand it dialectically, and then you learn to perform it. A lot of times we teach music just by performance, just the rhetoric of it, leaving out the other parts of it. And so sometimes and that's the way we teach art too. As a result, you've got students who maybe can, play a little bit or make a pretty picture and put it on the refrigerator. They don't know much about it, and often it doesn't go beyond that. This is a model for more thoroughly learning it. Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. All right. Well, thank you.